is that we have a theme, we see it repeatedly from the Chumash, and certainly from the Mefarshei Chumash, on through the Gemara, that the death of the righteous brings kapara. It brings absolution for sin. And it's important to remember that kapara, in other contexts, we've touched a little bit on the difference between slicha and chila with kapara. And that kapara, I argued at the time, as Rashi brings in the Chumash, that the bowls with which the blood was offered on the altar were called kaparot. Right? Because Rashi says that you would be mekaneach at the etzba, right? That the din of zrikat adam is that each zrika with the etzba has to actually be from the bowl and not from your etzba. I mean, so each one has to be a fresh offering. The kohen can't just dip his hand, get it all bloody, and do it there. He has to clean off the remains of the previous nitina and then offer it again. And Rashi says the reason that they're called kaparot is that he uses the edge of the bowl to be mekanech at the etzba. So Rav Soloveitchik, in his work Ala Tshuva, says that this is a core meaning of kapara. It actually removes the consequences of sin, as opposed to slicha, which is almost in the sense the opposite, which we said. We're not denying that it happened, God. I'm not even looking for absolution. I'm just asking you not to define me by that action, which leaves obviously more work to be done. Okay, so that being said, the question of the righteous, the death of the righteous bringing absolution for sin is exactly the crux reason I believe that Ela Eskara finds its way into our machzor theologically. There's another reason, perhaps, socio-culturally, that we'll speak about. But let's just quickly review the construct. We spoke about the context of the midrash itself and the death of the 10 Martyrs as representative of this crushing span of history for Am Yisrael, from the destruction of the Second Temple until the real final dispersion in the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt. That's from 70 of the Common Era through approximately 135 of the Common Era. And I pointed out how brutal not just the imagery of the midrash is in terms of the raking of flesh and the burning alive, but how brutal the actual period was, right? Maybe I mentioned it, but it's important to note that in that context, as Christianity is born, early Christianity does not use the cross as its symbol. The symbol of early Christianity is the fish. Right? Why does early Christianity not use the cross? The argument is made by present historians is that it's very obvious, is that the cross in the time of early Christianity was still an active torture device. And it was just not something that one would take pride in. Right? There are deeper arguments that historians will make that the cross, right, the fish represents the resurrection and the idea of salvation. The cross will come to represent suffering. Right? And in that context, it's important to note that after the 100 or so years of suffering which gets codified in the existential drama between Esav, who is Edom, who is Rome, who becomes Christianity in the minds of the Chachamim, we have the transition of Christianity being a persecuted minority within the Roman Empire to becoming not immediately a majority, but a dominant minority, and then ultimately a majority within the Roman Empire. And that process is driven also by martyrdom, right? To the point where Tertullius, one of the early martyrs, will say that Christian blood is Christian seed. I don't know what the quote is in Latin. I'm sure it sounds very impressive. But the understanding that the more you kill us, you make us stronger, right? And because the Christians were unwilling to accept the notion that the Caesar had the right to dictate conscience and did not have the protected status that Am Yisrael, that Judaism had in the Roman Empire as a recognized religion, they suffered under Diocletian and the emperor before him after, but Diocletian was the big guy who was really throwing Christians to the lions in the 3rd century of the Common Era, right? To the point where this was a formative experience for Christianity. The number of martyrs was actually, relative to the number of Christians, small. But as we know, they all became, not all of them, but many of them became saints, and their example loomed large. The parallel, I hope, at this point, should be obvious. That also, too, the number of the Aseret Harugei Malchut is, of course, 10. Right? And as I pointed out, that many of these stories appear elsewhere. Right? We talked about Echad Rabati, and people know the story of Rabbi Kiva from the Gemara, etc. But there are a couple of the 10 martyrs who appear nowhere else but in this midrash. So we have no way of locating who they are. There are, of course, critical historians who will claim that they never existed. Why does this matter to us? Because what's the number 10? Right, it's whole. It's wholeness. So what were the Chachamim really choosing? I mean, there weren't 11. There was nobody else chashuv they could have stuck in the number, or maybe there was one that was less. I don't really know. No, they chose the number 10 because the number 10 is wholeness. Because what the whole story is about is Mesirat Nefesh, the power of the totality of sacrifice, right? But as I pointed out to you last week, and it's important to keep in mind because it's actually the focus today, when Rabbi Akiva declares Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, which is the central notion of Yom Kippur, in my opinion, right? When he declares that, and he's marich v'yatzav nishmato be'echad, right? Who is watching? It's not just the Romans. It's not just the Caesars. It's not just his awful daughter who has that skin of Rabbi Shmuel's face in her hands. Yeah. It's his students. And they say, Rabbi, like, even now? And he says, my whole life I've been waiting for this moment. And I wanted to point out last week that the student's experience of this is critical because martyrdom as a mass movement is a short-lived movement, right? But martyrdom as an example for those who take the other side of Mesirat Nefesh, who choose to live for what they believe, as opposed to die for what they believe. The examples of the martyr becomes extremely important in the message that's taken out. Not just the personal willingness to die, but what were they dying for? Because if I'm not given that opportunity, and we'll see how in the Crusades it becomes to be seen as a tremendous opportunity to the point where we have in the hands of the Beit Yosef, that is, depending on how you see the Maggid Mesharim, but we have in the hands of the Beit Yosef the fact that he longed for the death of the martyrs. Right? Because the Beit Yosef was expelled from Spain at a relatively young age. He was approximately 13. And of course, the Beit Yosef at 13 knew exactly what was going on in the world. He was not some, like, obtuse 13-year-old kid. And he saw the sacrifice all around him. So this idea of longing for that death from someone whose life brought so much to Am Yisrael should stick in your minds. Because he didn't seek death. He lived a constant process of Mesirut Nefesh, which is poorly translated, by the way, as self-sacrifice. Mesirut Nefesh just means simply handing over your life. Handing over your life. You got it from God, you're giving it back. And now that can happen, Shalom Neidam Mizeh, in a moment of kfiyah, where someone comes to force you to deny or affirm your belief. Or it could happen every morning when you get up a little bit earlier than you would have liked to, and you strap on your tefillin and you say words which you may or may not relate to, and you may not have time to actually say properly, and then you got to get to work. That's a different type of Mesirat Nefesh. And that's a Mesirat Nefesh of the students who will actually have Hemshake, because that type of Mesirat Nefesh as a long-term movement actually works. But the dynamic is tough because, of course, after several years of getting up to do that, what's the big problem? Why am I doing this again? Right, yeah, where's the motivation come from? Where's the clarity of understanding of why I'm doing that? Right, and all this is I'm setting up not just to get us back in the flow of history, but in order to argue that, in my understanding, this is precisely why El Ezra ends up as one of the, perhaps the crowning moment of the crowning prayer of the whole year. So, Christianity goes through its period of martyrdom in the 3rd century as Rome is going through, I pointed out to you, what's known as the century of troubles. Right? This is when the Roman Empire got too big to administer properly from one center any longer. Ultimately, there was an attempt to break it into 2 Caesars and 2 sub-Caesars, and I'm not going to get into the whole thing. Constantine is the one who decides to reunite the empire under one rule, no longer with its base in Rome, but now in, you guessed it, Constantinople, right? Also Istanbul, also Constantinople. And as I pointed out, in 312, he conquers Rome. In the Battle of Milvian Bridge, he gives testimony that he has this famous experience of, under this sign you shall conquer. He sees the cross in the sky in his dreams, right? And then he conquers the city. And there are modern historians who will tell you, and he claims that in the morning, he told his troops to tie a sword across a spear and to carry that into battle. Don't miss the transition. What does he use as a symbol? The crucifix. And it's with 2 weapons of war, something which both of which early Christianity would have looked at and said, really? The cross is a device of torture, and these are weapons of war, when they were quintessentially the people who were looking for the kingdom of peace, right? But I point that out because many of their points of conflict with the Roman authorities were in the legions. Christian got brought into the legions were required to do sacrifice. Before they went into battle, they were required to do daily sacrifice for the cult of the emperor, etc. And the Christians would say, well, I'm sorry, I don't do that. Jews were excused from it because they were a recognized religion. So anyway, either way, he conquers, and historians will say one of two things. One, there was a significant Christian minority in Rome already. These were the internal proletariat of Rome. Many of them were slaves or are just otherwise disenfranchised people. I pointed out to you that much of the internal proletariat of Rome were actually displaced Hellenic culture, meaning because Rome conquered the great empires of the Greeks that were the Oriental Hellenic, the Hellenistic, really, not really Hellenic, they were Hellenistic. But these are people of deep culture and past who were taken into slavery, uprooted from everything they knew, which is why Christianity, which in its essence has that sort of Oriental mystery appeal, but also was a way to deny the world in which we were trapped in order to free yourself into a greater world, was extremely appealing to the slave and sort of like there was no working class, but there was a very dependent poor in Rome, right? Because for years, Rome, the whole peninsula of Italy, had destroyed its local agriculture and become large-scale plantation agriculture, which meant that there were large numbers of slaves and large numbers of people who had previously been freeholders who are now desperately poor in the city, who were supported largely by largesse. A big part of local politics in Rome was just the dispersion of pan et circa, as we talked about, bread and games. Right? That's why the Roman history, you're always seeing movies with Rome. Why are they always like at the gladiator games? Is because that was something a wealthy person could do to make themselves popular. It was something a poor person could do to get their mind off of how miserable their life was.
It's like when you put your name on a stadium.
Yeah, but the difference was more in the immediate experience. And they would import like a huge importation of wheat from Egypt, which was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, and then disperse it to the poor in the streets as a populist effort to then stand up in the Senate and claim that they spoke for the people. You know, anyway, there's a whole dynamic there. You have to understand that Christianity had already had a widespread appeal in the disenfranchised in Rome. So it could be that what Constantine was doing was just a very wise move of appealing to a good fifth column within the city, or it could be that he had a genuine conversion. It doesn't really matter to us. I'm just pointing out to you that any way you cut it, Christianity goes from being a persecuted minority to the religion, the nominal religion of the emperor, to within, by 380, Theodosius actually declares Christianity the sole imperial religion, and it's only within about 3 years that he then bans pagan practice within the Roman Empire, which again has a nominal effect. I mean, you know, how much Rome was able to assert its authority in every corner of the empire was actually part of the reason it was falling apart. Nevertheless, from a perspective that within 100 years, Christianity goes from being food for the lions in the stadiums to the sole official imperial religion, right? And during that stretch of time, our sages are taking their historical experience of 100 or so years of bloody war and martyrdom and watching how Christianity transforms itself from having the same experience into a world power. And what's the big challenge that poses to them? Does God love us anymore? I mean, let's face it. We're sitting here in Eretz Yisrael. We've all been raised how we were raised, and there's a good long history behind that. And whatever it is you personally think about whether God has chosen the chosen people, or whether God chose the chosen people and gave up on them, or maybe he never chose the chosen people, etc., is shaped by a certain set of historical, social, educational circumstance. The Chachamim were looking the lion in the face. The temple had been destroyed. We had been completely removed from our land. And then a heretical sect from within our own society, which took very powerful teachings and claimed to be the New Testament, and was based, of course, in Scripture. Don't forget, it's very important. Why is it in the very same time, in the 5th century of the Common Era, St. Augustine of Hippo, develops a theology which in many ways will set the model for Jewish-Christian relations, at least in Europe, where Christianity becomes dominant, for the next 1,500 years. And this is called the model of the suffering remnant. What is the problem that Christianity has with Judaism? It's very simple. If God rejected Am Yisrael and chose the Christians as the spiritual Israel, then what should have happened to the Jews? They should have just disappeared. Now, you would think then that would lead Christianity to do what? Try to make the most of it, which is, by the way, there is that stream, particularly once Christianity manages to seize the Roman Empire, we see some significant, what we would today call pogroms in certain bishoprics in Asia Minor, not so far from here as well, in like Lebanon, etc. But they have another problem. What's Christianity's primary proof that what they're telling you is true?
The Jewish texts.
The Jewish texts. And the Jews represent the truth of those texts. So they're living in this tension, is that on one hand, the Jews need to disappear because they're the outdated model. On the other hand, they actually need the Jews from a theological perspective in order to uphold the truth of their evidence. And so Augustine posits a very simple, even lahavdil, elegant solution. She says is that the Jews will continue to exist as a suffering remnant to teach the world the price for rejecting the truth. Because, of course, the Jews were supposed to know. I don't know how much you guys have read the New Testament, but there's that whole scene where we're like, basically, we don't want him. Take him. Kill him, and we wash our hands of the whole thing. And the Jews were basically, according to the Christian scripture, recognized the status of Jesus of Nazareth and rejected it. And so, therefore, God will punish them throughout time until, and this is where the other piece of classical Christian theology comes from, in the end of days, the second coming, the Jews will all convert. Now, again, I want to be clear on something. Not today, these points of theology, for many Christians, by the way, they're unaware of them, in all fairness. For many sects of Christianity, particularly the Protestant ones, they're no longer considered accepted theology. And I'm not going to go into right now, but even the Catholic Church, which is holding the traditional theological history of the situation, had to reevaluate its relationship to Judaism in the early 60s, in my opinion, due to the fact that we're now sitting here in Jerusalem having this conversation. It was a little bit hard to make the suffering remnant argument when we were suddenly becoming a world power again in our own land. So anyway, but it's important.
Totally bracketing late 20th century and 21st century Christian fundamentalism. Well,
they have their own takes on this, and they break into different branches as well. Some of them are actually philo-Semitic. They really love the Jews and just see themselves. And some of them are eschatological in the sense that they're just waiting for the last shoe to drop, and it's important that the Jews be here in order that we all convert en masse. But I know both. But either way, the reason I raise this is because the continued survival of Am Yisrael is going to have an outer face and an inner face. The outer face is the Christian empire will have a perfect role for the Jews now. But the inner face is how are we as Am Yisrael going to relate to the fact of this triumphant heresy, which is how we're still looking at it. Right? It will take a while for Christianity to really cease to be seen by the Jews as an internal heresy. The process really begins with the adoption of the Roman Empire, because then the Hellenic roots of Christianity really begin to dominate the rabbinic roots. But I would argue that a lot of what's happening in the Middle Ages is the final battle over whether these people are heretics and we need to prove them wrong, or we're just on different tracks. As an aside, I won't go into it now, but you should understand that the rise of Islam poses a very similar challenge. In just as powerful, not more powerful way, because what happens is you have this religion that comes mamish out of nowhere, sweeps the entirety of Asia Minor, and, well, they don't get, actually, because the Orthodox Christians hold them all from Asia Minor proper, but sweeps the Middle East, as we would call it today, all of North Africa, right to Spain, within the space of 100 years, less. And what is born out of that, and we speak about in the full history course in the year, what born out of that is actually Jewish philosophy. Rav Saadia Gaon's attempt to bring a theology, a systematic theology to the understanding of the world. But what is born out of our, so that's an aside, but what's born out of our engagement with the fact that the Christianity triumphant is a true theological challenge, we're not into theology yet in the sense of systematic, organized presentation of beliefs. What we're into is, how do we experience this? So, what's the answer? What is the answer that Eila Ezkara offers for the question of how could it be that Christianity is triumphant, that Rome is triumphant, And that the sages, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shmuel Kohen HaGadol, who we see, of course, in the Piyut, actually use the name of God to rise above the world to contact the truth. Which means what? Who's got the truth? The Jews. That never gets questioned. Remember the Piyut? We spoke about its structure. And it's going to become more and more important now that we have a little bit of the background, right? The Piyut begins with the fact that, in its full sense, if you look in the midrash, not necessarily the way it starts in your machzor, with the fact that the sages were teaching Caesar Torah. And he was doing chazara one morning, and he came across the story of Yosef, and he said, wait a minute. Now, I just saw back in, I think it's in Mishpatim, right? The what? In Kitete. What the punishment for selling a brother into slavery is in Kitete? Okay. I just saw the punishment of selling a brother into slavery is death. These brothers of Joseph, they sold him, they never got punished. It's kasha. So he brings the sages in and he says, that's it, you're done. Right? You're all going to die. Because there's nobody like you in the world. If the 10 brothers were alive today, I would do justice. Notice what he wants to do. He wants to do justice. I would do justice on them. But you're it. And what do they say to him? They say, give us 3 days to find out what's the origin of this decree. Notice, this is a classic empowerment move of the oppressed. What did they do? They shifted the frame. When you have no power in a current struggle, right? Caesar's got their arm behind the back. If they say no, what's he going to do? Just chop their heads off, right? So they say, wait, we're not going to disagree with you. We want to check in with the higher power. So what they do is they attach themselves to a framework within which Caesar is an agent and not the driver of the situation. And which makes them no longer subject to his will, but subject to the same higher will that they've always been subject to. Right? This is a very important historical model. Right? We see it again and again and again. Did the Romans destroy Jerusalem? Did the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem? Did the Crusaders kill the Jews? No, you just said it the day before yesterday. It was because of our sins that we were driven out from our land. The Romans, they were the agents. The Rebbeinu Shalom has all kinds of agents in the world. Oh, of course, they're responsible for their moral decisions. Everybody, right? We say we're golim, zchut ayedei zakayim, v'chiyuv ayedei chayavim. Right? Good things come in the world at the hands of good people, and bad things come in the world at the hands of bad people. And bad people who do things even in the interest of God still get whacked. That's one of the major messages of the end of Ha'azinu. I don't know if you guys noticed that in Shul yesterday. But the vengeance which God uses the nations to wreak upon us is secondary only to the vengeance he then wreaks upon the nations for doing their job. And there are all kinds of farshim reasons of why that would happen. They were a little too enthusiastic, whatever, it doesn't matter. But you see the power of that stance? No, the Romans don't matter. The Babylonians don't matter. That's a historical empowerment. We have agencies because of our sins that we were driven from our land. Therefore, we want to get back to our land. Who does it lie upon to get us back? Ourselves. Right? That's the primary historical vision that emerges. So they go to God, and they prove, by the way, right? And I just want to point out that the elevation or the ascendant, that's the ascent of Rabbi Shmuel, you should know, is part of a larger midrashic literature which was codified during the Byzantine era called the Hechalot Rabbati literature, which is a series of discussions about using various names of God to ascend through the Hechalot, through the palaces, toward the deeper presence or higher presence, however you want to conceptualize that, of God. Right? We would call it practical metaphysics today, meaning prophecy. That these were the tools that remained. And interestingly enough, if you want to look in where it appears, where it appears in the Rishonim, any guesses? And where it appears in the writing of the Rishonim? Hilchos Nira. We have a negia to it, and get it? In Hilchos Nira. Why?
Because it's all connected to purity.
Right, and what happens at the end? Rabbi Ishmael goes, by the way, in the full description in the Hechal literature, what does it say? That Rabbi Ishmael sits down, and he has this incredibly pure young boy standing next to him, to whom he is whispering, and the boy is his maturgaman. He's speaking it out. And that the sages sit around him, and a wall of blue flame rises around them, and the Talmidim are sitting like in an amphitheater. They can't hear what's being said. They're just watching. The sages are inside. They're hearing it, but they're hearing only through the voice of his maturgaman. And he goes, and he sees what he sees. And he hears Ma'achorei Pargod. Right? What's the Pargod? Right? It's that which divides between essence and expression. in its simplest sense. But what's on the other side of the Pargot is not accessible, because that's God's experience of himself, as it were. Right? What goes on the other side of the Pargot is what? Independent? No. It's a manifestation of that essence, which means that everything that happens comes from God. Which means that when they hear the voice of Gabriel telling them this is from God, accept it, they come back to Caesar, and are they looking at Caesar any longer? No. They're looking at God. So when they're Moser Nefesh, who are they Moser Nefesh to? Not Caesar. God. Right? And this becomes a model by which the Chachamim can now turn the suffering remnant inside out. Augustine says we got a theological problem, we got to kill all the Jews because we're supposed to replace them, but we need them around to prove it to us, so we'll let a few suffering ones stick around until the end of days. The Chachamim say, why are we suffering so much? Because of our sins. It comes from God. Who are these people who are causing us to suffer? They'll get theirs in the end. And by the way, who does responsibility lie with? Us. And specifically whom? The rabbinic leadership. Because Bar Kokhba was not just a blow to the political aspirations of Am Yisrael and to a certain vision of earthy realism in messianic realization. It was a blow to every other model of leadership other than the rabbinic. And one of the reasons that Rabbi Akiva, in certain Mamarot in the Gemara, he doesn't get spoken of so nicely in connection to the Bar Kokhba revolt, but he basically, we kind of ignore that aspect of his career because of his status as a foundation of the Torah Shebaal Peh. But after Bar Kokhba revolt, the sole model of leadership that is left to Am Yisrael, more or less, is rabbinic leadership. Leadership of the Torah, leadership of the wise, people who no longer are attempting to guide events in the kingly, forceful fashion, but are attempting to use their wisdom to understand where the hand of God lies behind events. That doesn't mean they're passive. Don't misunderstand me. But as a perspective, that becomes the model of leadership. Why does this matter for our purpose? Because as we go through time and certain aspects of the world get fixed, and I cannot encourage you enough that in the learning of history, the biggest challenge is intellectual anachronism. It is extremely hard to understand what it was like to live in 5th century Rome. For instance, I want you all to picture the Earth right now. What? Yes, even so. Right? I want you to picture planet Earth right now in your mind. Right? The very fact that you know what I'm talking about when I say planet Earth, and that you all probably pictured a globe, puts you way outside the conception of the people who live then. Maps were a rarity. Right? You know who coined the name Palestina for the area in which we are sitting right now? It was Hadrian. Right? Hadrian, when he decided he was going to destroy the Jewish religion, realized he had a logistical issue. If there were people who were called Jews, where are they from? Judea. Right? And so Hadrian wanted to get rid of Judaism, and he said, well, for sure, then I got to get rid of this place called Judea, because if there's always a place called Judea, there will always be a people called the Jews. I'll call it after the Philistines. Palestina. Right? And he named it that. And of course, why was this so effective? Because the Romans were the only ones making maps. Right? So from then on, and he was the emperor after all, from then on, with the exception of some rare maps that had existed from beforehand, and of course whom? The Jews, who keep saying, well, yeah, it's called Eretz Yisrael, it's called Judea, we have the whole story, we know the story. Hanukkah becomes extremely important this time. I'm going to stay focused, but you should understand that Hanukkah becomes extremely important in my opinion. There are historical arguments in the time of Herod is the first time that Hanukkah really becomes a true national celebration. And post Bar Kokhba, Hanukkah becomes an ideal because of the national experience that's happening. But either way, the impact, I can't even picture the world. I don't know what's there if I keep walking in this direction, right? Number one. Number two, this calendar that begins to emerge. This today, we like we all said, what time do we daven mincha today, and are we allowed to do them? What the fast day, etc. Forget the fact that they couldn't measure time with the precision that we measure, right? But the very idea that the fixing of the ritual cycle happened by actual people in a physical place. Like, you want to know when the month. It's not that they hadn't been calculating it beforehand. We know this in the Gemara. They always had calculations. But the ability to actually fix those dates was still dependent upon the Sanhedrin. Right? It's only in this time when it begins, people argue, that this issuing of the fixed calendar in 358, and I said in quotes because I pointed out that it continues to be worked upon up until the time of the Gaonim, but they say the issuing of the calendar was the last official meeting of the Sanhedrin. And that the Sanhedrin actually is dissolved in 425, and Rabbi Gamliel the 7th is executed by Rome. I don't have it right here. Is it the 7th? Oh wait, I have it right. The 6th, executed by Rome. And then the Romans exercised the prerogative of appointing a head of the Sanhedrin by just simply not appointing anyone, and then the Sanhedrin ceases to function after 425. Right? No, but you see the context of what's happening. It's very hard to understand.
It's pretty big
So,
gap though between 358, that's the last official meeting, and 425.
right. For sure. I mean, that's why they say the last official meeting in the sense that that's the last time anything definitive was done. I mean, and we know that the Sanhedrin was alternative. The primary function, and actually this is important to understand in the context, is that once Am Yisrael becomes a foreign element within the Christian empire, the primary point of relationship between the Jews and the Christians was what? Don't say program. Yes, money in specific what?
Banking.
Taxes. Banking emerges later. You're correct. The Jews
Who was
pay.
the emperor that dissolved the Sanhedrin? Or by virtue of...
Who was the emperor at that time? I don't have it written down here. We can find it out. But by the way, 425, the Rome will have its final sack and the last Western Roman emperor in 476. So they're like 50 years, and Constantinople will continue for a long time with what's called the Eastern Roman, or then becomes the Orthodox, Roman Empire. But Rome as Rome, the last Western Roman Empire, is only 50 years away from that. The period, and we're just going to fast forward because it's impossible not to. The period from this reorientation of Am Yisrael and the Christian world and Rome to our point of interest, which really begins with Crusade, right, is known as the Dark Ages. And in the longer version of the history class, you'll hear me say again and again, just everything I'm going to tell you, just prefaced by dirty, ignorant, and like short or something, yeah.
I just wanted to clarify what point you were trying to make about the calendar.
That our conceptions of time and geography are so radically different than what people who lived then that it's hard to understand the impact of setting a mold like what the Chachamim are trying to do. Like, we live within those worlds. Right? The Mishnah gets codified and it becomes what I think of as the portable homeland. It is the context within which we will be talking to each other across time and space for the next 2,000 years. What's being done right now is a setting of mental constructs. We'll spend a lot of time during the year talking about what I call the construction of exile. The Chachamim created an exile within which we can not only survive, but thrive. And one of the primary pillars of that exile was Mipnei Chateinu Gilinu Me'artzenu. Because now, if I say because of our sins we were expelled from our land, I'm able to embrace every single situation just like the 10 Martyrs did. I can look at whatever paritz, or whatever oppressor is coming to crush me, and I can say, Chatati Pashiti, you, I don't have to worry about you. I have to worry about the Rebbeinu Olam and what I'm doing. What's the problem with that?
Doesn't sound. I mean, if you take World War II.
Okay, so you're already. By the time you get to World War, the problem with it is what you're saying. Is really, God, like really, still, like which sins were those? I'm sorry, I lost count back there in the 14th century. So that problem, as much as I'm being a little bit mocking of it, you have to understand is that it begins to crumble. In my opinion, you see it in the literature, in not in the keynote so much, but in the historiographic literature. The Veil of Tears and the other classic historiographic literature of the late Middle Ages, where they really start asking, like, ad matai, how long are we going to say and one of the things that happens is that Jewish guilt is rooted in my opinion, in this perspective. Because at a certain point, if you're not really sure what your sins were, but you know for sure you've just been getting whacked for centuries, you're going to walk around with this internalized feeling that everything is your fault. Not in the empowering, everything is my fault and therefore I can fix everything, but in the crushing, guilt-laden, everything's my fault. And that's disempowering, and that leads itself to religious fatalism. And we will speak about, like I said, in the longer term, that in my opinion is one of the major drivers for the pursuit of the Zionist movement. And I use that word deliberately, right? The breaking out of the Zionist movement. A lot of it was an attempt to shuck off inherited historical guilt for a return of a different model of agency within history. But we're not there yet. So after the darkest part of the Dark Ages, in which the Jews did okay, the Jews were left like flotsam and jetsam at the high tide of the Western Roman Empire. Basically, wherever Rome had a military outpost of any significance, Jews made it there. There are some historians who will tell you that at the height of the Roman Empire, as many as 25% of the citizens of the Roman Empire identified as Jewish. Now, that's highly controversial, number one.
10% is not controversial.
10% is no longer considered controversial, but I'm giving you the high number to make you understand that there is a radical shift, because once we start getting records of the Crusades, that number has shrunk to like a sum total of like 10,000. As Rav Fink loves to point out, in the time of the Tosfos, the Jewish community of Paris, the largest Jewish community in Europe, was approximately 40 families. Yeah. Well, the question is, one of the big things is that you have to understand, whatever that means, these people identified themselves as Jewish.
There were limits on how many Jews could populate in that particular area.
That became, actually, that was a product of the later Middle Ages. The economics drove a lot of what was happening, and just the way the sociology broke down. Meaning the Jews were left, like I said, as the flotsam and jetsam on the high tide of the Roman Empire. They weren't like we had big concentrations. Or when urbanization begins as a European, remember, of course, that's in the context of remembering that most people in Europe live directly off the land. It's not like urban concentration was the norm.
I'm sorry. When you say at the beginning of the First Crusade?
No. By the time of the Tosfos, like 13th, 12th, 13th century. But
Were they big families?
yeah, they were decent sized. Yeah, they had minyan. But look, you see, the Shulchan Aruch is full of halachot about your obligation if you're going to leave town before Shabbat, or certainly the Yom Tovim, of having to hire a replacement for you for the minyan. So we see in this that the assumption was that you were really happy if you live somewhere where there's a minyan, and that was not necessarily the norm. Okay, I'm just saying that because I want you to picture Am Yisrael scattered throughout Europe. Europe itself is not doing so well from the perspective of knowledge of the world, from the perspective of being able to harness its natural resources to achieve anything above subsistence level, and even that, right? We know that the scale of malnutrition that everybody knows, everybody was littler in the Middle Ages, right? We've all seen those suits of armor in the museums and said, I didn't realize Galahad was a midget, right? And he said, no, he was actually average for his day because people were malnourished, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Within that, the Jews held a very important position, largely driven by banking and taxation. See, the feudal system of Europe was a land-based system, right? And the feudal lord began his concentration of power by being able to strap on his armor, jump on his war horse, and basically whack anybody who got in his way. Once he'd done that once or twice, all the people who lived on the land stopped making him do it, and he could put on velvet and just ride on the fancy horse with a stick, right? But he still had a problem, because he had no cash. All his wealth was in land. So therefore, to get cash, you know what he did? Tax the poor. But that's really a messy and sort of undignified job. But you know who understood the process of taxation? The Jews. They understood it because we'd been doing it with Rome for a long time, paying collective tax. And a process called tax farming developed, which is a feudal lord would say, these are my estates. Jew, I expect this amount of taxation. You can keep the rest. You can imagine that doesn't create a loving relationship between taxor and taxee. Number one. Number two, the Jews also understood the power of basic financial instruments, right? In the Dark Ages, if you put 100 gold pieces on your donkey and started to ride toward the east in order to buy spices, which were in high demand in the courts of Europe, how far were you really going to get with those 100 gold pieces? Not too far, unless you spent most of it on guards. But if one Jew said to another Jew, I got a brother in Baghdad, give me 100 gold pieces, and I'll write you a letter to my brother that says you gave me 100 gold pieces. And when you get there, you'll give him this letter, and he'll give you 100 gold pieces. Now, that letter is no good to anybody other than the person who it's written out to, right? And this is the beginning of the modern ability for commerce. So a bill of exchange is what it's called. It precedes the check, yeah?
Yeah.
They didn't. I want to be clear. Jews didn't invent this concept. Jews had an international network that was able to actualize this concept to its commercial advantage, yeah?
What about usury? I thought one of the...
Also, that was my third piece. So also the Christians, for whatever reason, hung on to the Isser Ribit, the prohibition against usury, right? And therefore, the ability to have cash liquidity was extremely limited. And the Jews, of course, were permitted al pi halacha, even though it's not so clear that the Rishonim were in favor of doing it, right? They were permitted al pi halacha to charge interest to non-Jews, and therefore they played a very important role. Usury is a usurious rate of interest. Doesn't mean you're taking interest; it means you're taking an exorbitant interest. This is the background. I have 15 minutes left, and I want to actually answer our primary question. So, but it's important you understand that background. I'm going to say it again so it's clear. Number one, there's a deep theological question which began with the rise of Christianity and has not gone away about who's right. Who does God really want as his people in the world? Number one. Number two, there's I'll call it a socioeconomic relationship, which has to do with the transition of Rome as a centralized empire into the rise of what are basically the German tribal states that are the predecessors to the feudal system, which is itself the predecessor to the modern nation states. That is a process, by the way, that we will spend significant time touching on throughout the course of development history. I think it's extremely important to understand. So that's a socioeconomic back. So there's the philosophical and the socioeconomic. So what happens at the First Crusade? The First Crusade, when that you have a social and economic structure which developed out of the Roman Empire into the German tribal states, into the feudal system, which eventually would come to European nation states, that the Jew plays a critical role in the commercial aspect of, via tax farming, commerce, and money lending. And remembering that there were not that many Jews. We're not talking about 19th century urban Jewry. They're dispersed. But because of that, they are felt as an indigestible element within what is a dispersed society. So, that being the context, when the Muslims, I told you, came out of the Arabian Peninsula and conquered all of North Africa and actually crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and took France from the Visigoths, they were stopped in the Pyrenees by Charles Martel in 732 at the Battle of Tours. And that was the birth of the idea of Christian Europe. I'm not going to go through, Charles Martel is the predecessor of the Carolingian Empire. You guys maybe heard of Charlemagne, etc. Don't get it, but you can just believe me, and we'll talk about it more during the year, right? That Battle of Tours was the birth of Christian Europe in the sense that was the first time this mass of people ever thought of itself as a one unit in opposition to this invading other unit. So that was the birth of Christian Europe. Then the Crusades is the first foreign policy of Christian Europe, right? Pope Urban II, I believe. Well, there's a funny thing. We're going to get into the nature of the role of the church in the crusade and the suffering of the Jews. So I'm going to hold my tongue on that one. He declares a holy mission to redeem the Holy Land from the hands of the Muslim infidels. Now, historians will tell you that there are all kinds of motivations behind this. That there was an extreme problem with feudalism and the subdivision of property, and what you had is basically a bunch of noble children who had no land to inherit, and therefore were looking for new space to expand. You had a growing population in Europe due to certain shifts in agricultural technology, right? You also had a power structure that was struggling between the ecclesiastical authority of the Pope and the Christian Church and the what's the other, the civil authority, we'll just call it, the temporal authority of the princes and the Holy Roman Emperor within Europe. Again, that's just the big picture. It doesn't matter for us. He declares that all good Christians must go liberate the Holy Land and the Sepulchre, the Church of the Sepulchre, from the Muslim infidel, and they hear the call, right? Not only the nobles, but there was also a foot crusade. Masses, literally, by the way, one of the ways to understand this is that this was a semi-barbarian, nomadic movement out of Europe into Asia, which is the counterpoint of the semi-barbarian, nomadic movements out of Central Asia into Europe that we know as the Magyars, the Huns, right? People who really shape European history. It's often missed that you're basically just seeing, and if you look at the track at which they walked, it's the same. Because they had to take the steps, they had to cross the mountains. But I mean, you're basically just seeing a counter for them. Now, because we're Europeans and we're very sophisticated, we have our ideological explanation. But like Attila the Hun didn't think that he was chosen by the great god of the sky to bring, certainly what's his name? The Mongols. What's his name?
Genghis Khan.
Thank you, Genghis Khan. Absolutely saw himself as the anointed of God. So, like, just pointing out for a little bit of context. Either way, as Jews were probably familiar with what the Crusaders realized really quickly, which was, we're going to walk all the way to the Holy Land to kill infidels? We've got them right here. And that would be the Jews. And the First Crusade is marked by the death, and again, the numbers are hard to say because everybody's got their ideology behind them, and the records that we have, the first-hand accounts, are assumed to be highly exaggerated, not because everybody assumes that it's an anti-Semite, because that's the way in which records were kept. The emphasis was not on statistics. The emphasis was on the rhetoric and the experience. It doesn't matter. Horrific, because what happened was the backbone of Ashkenaz Jewry were the three communities of Worms, Speyer, and Mainz, the Rhine Valley, what are known as Kilot Shum. You may know their names from where? The Kinot, Rashi for sure, but the Kinot on Tisha B'Av, right? There are more than one. There's like a set, I think it's like 3 or 4, right, of Kinot that are about the destruction of these communities. In a nutshell, the First Crusade is what took the smile out of Ashkenazi Jewry. And we basically haven't smiled since. Maybe coming back to Eretz Yisrael, maybe. Right? But to this day, there are things in the liturgy. For instance, who said Av HaRachamim yesterday after the Seder Kriyas Torah before Musaf? Av HaRachamim is a commemoration of the martyrs of Kilot Shum. Right? And they all died in the lead up to Shavuot in the year of 1096. Litzari, I don't remember the actual year in the Jewish calendar. But the experience of the Crusades was marked by a choice of martyrdom, right? The stories, as they're told in the Kinot, as they're told in the contemporary accounts, emphasize the fact that parents killed their children, teachers killed their students, husbands killed their wives, women threw themselves in rivers to drown rather than kiss the cross and accept Christianity, even in a nominal sense, right? And when you look at the Kinot, and by the way, El Ezkara is the surviving remnant of what apparently in medieval European machzorim was a whole set of slichot that were inserted into the Yom Kippur, just as, if you notice, Ashkenazi slichot tend to have a heavy emphasis on what? Suffering in exile. And what are we saying to God? Let it be for kapara. We said it this morning. Let it be for kapara. All these awful things, let it be kapara. That is the theme of Ashkenazi slichot and kinot. Kinot makes sense, right? That's Tisha B'Av. Why the slichot? What's the connection? You're saying slicha. You're asking God. What do the Sfardim do in their slichot? They sing and they celebrate rachamim. Because the very fact that you can ask God for forgiveness is an indication that He's willing to give it. What could make you happier? What if you didn't have that indication? It would be pretty miserable. Why is it that the Ashkenazim spend the energy in slichot commemorating suffering? It's because the national experience was redeemed through these slichot. What do I mean? Is that after the Crusade, it didn't get much easier. By the way, what I mean about in the First Crusade, I would say it looks to me from like cross analysis of the few sources I've actually managed to delve into, 10,000 is a fair number. It may be a little high, thousands. We'll just say thousands, but in awful ways. Many of them by their own hands, right? The Second Crusade, interestingly enough, very few Jews died. Why? You know who protected them? No, there were plenty left, and that's important to understand. There were plenty left, because the stories would lead us to believe that everybody was Moser Nefesh. But as we know from the story of Rabbi Akiva, what happens if you have a mass movement for martyrdom? There's nobody left. It was the leadership.
Suicide squad.
Right? They were a suicide squad. It was the leadership, and the leadership of a very specific nature. Who is it, the stories that we have of suffering? It's the Talmidei Chachamim. By the way, there was a whole ritual. If you look into the literature, there was a bracha on Shechita. There was a whole developed ritual which sometimes was related to Shechita, sometimes was related to Mila, sometimes was a Chatuna, right? But you can look at it, it's really powerful, these images. Again, and we know these things actually happen because the thing about these descriptions that were brought down in the other slichot that you're less familiar with and in the historiography is they had to, on one hand, be graphic enough to evoke the response. And we're going to talk, we got 5 minutes left, so I'm not going to miss what's the goal we're trying to respond, right? On one hand, but they also had to be literal enough that the people who had lived through these things would take them seriously. And that's one of the indications that we have that these are not just sort of like melodramatic poetic representations of the 10 Martyrs. No, these are actually reflective of real experience writ large for a very specific educational purpose. But anyway, in the Second Crusade, who protected the Jews? The church. The church was very unhappy about the killing of the Jews in the First Crusade because, as I pointed out to you, the church believed theologically that the Jews actually needed to be protected. Not treated well, not loved and embraced, but not killed. So it's the church that actually saved the Jewish communities in the Second Crusade. Saint Bernard, who is not a person that we should love for the other things he did for Am Yisrael, of Clairvoy, was one of the primary impetus within the church to protect the Jews in the second and previous, but subsequently, only the First Crusade was when the Jews really suffered. The Albigensian Crusade, and etc. And again to that, but they killed more Christians there than anybody else. Well, they weren't really Christians.
All the Crusades killed more Christians.
That's true. But anyway, just to give you a couple of high points, the first recorded European blood libel we have is in 1144 in Britain, William of Norwich, right? The classic accusation of the Christian child who's taken, tortured. His blood is used for arcane ritual. This is the first one. He becomes a saint in the Anglican Church. And there's a very famous woodblock pamphlet. Because this is, of course, 300 years before the advent of Gutenberg's printing press. But nevertheless, this is an act of such significance that someone carved woodblock and printed a pamphlet to distribute in order to create a cult of martyrdom around William of Norwich and sear forever into the Jewish experience the blood libel. Because it will only be take it back, it will be about 55 years later that all the Jews are expelled from England. No, 1209. 1290? Oh yeah, I knew there was 100 and something, yeah. I had the numbers right, just in the wrong order. Right, in 1215 the Roman Church passes the Jewish badge edict, lest you think that the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, that I will say, right, came up with the idea of labeling the Jews. It was in 1215 that the church declared that all secular powers within which the Jews lived had to label their Jews. By the way, they didn't always do it, but it was around from 1215. What?
They weren't the first ones to do that.
No, the Muslims started it, actually. But this was, I'm just pointing out, we're talking about European Christian history. And then, of course, another kina that you're probably familiar with was the burning of wagon loads of the Talmud in Paris in 1242. Why do I add that on there? First of all, because it's just unbelievable to consider wagon loads of books in the era 200 years before the printing press were manuscripts which were largely, if they were young, written by the hands of the Tosfot. And if they weren't young, they were actually written in the hands of the Gaoni. The tragedy there is hard to imagine. So, this is the context within which Eila Ezkra is brought into the machzor. I want to tell you that I have not been able to nail down in my research exactly when it appears. There's a book in the Hebrew University Library that I've been able to get there to access. But I can tell you that it's not in machzor Vitri. I couldn't find it in there. I went through it. I couldn't find it. So, I mean, it could be that I missed it. But it basically appears after the First Crusade, within the next 150 years. Machzor Vitri is like 1117 or something. Right? So, within the next 150 years, Eila Ezkra appears at the crowning moment of the Yom Kippur service, although, as I pointed out, it appears in the context of a much larger set of slichot. It's not the soul, right? What's the goal here? I want to end on this. You guys will forgive me, and I might go over just like 2 or 3 minutes, which I don't like to do. But it's important to understand that there was a tremendous struggle going on within the hearts of Am Yisrael in early medieval Europe. And we really already laid out what that struggle was, but it's important to understand it in order that we can try to seek some guidance, A, of what we're trying to achieve on Yom Kippur, and B, have a deep question about whether this... sometimes you go to war for God, and you show up, and you realize you're on the wrong battlefield. But somebody who's geared up to fight doesn't generally just say, oh well, I'm going to go home. Sometimes you've got to create the conflict for yourself. And that's one of my concerns here. So what was going on is that there was basically 2 historical realities and 2 theological realities that were being lived in Europe. There was the dominant power of Christianity, which was able to control the lives of Am Yisrael and was asserting theologically its rectitude. And then there was the experience of the transition from somewhat harmonious existence to crushing, and it just gets worse and worse. I mean, the Black Plague's coming on the heels of this, and the Hussite Wars, and I forget the fact that it ends in World War II. I mean, it doesn't get much better for European Jewry. So there's also the historical experience and the theological assertion, right, of chosenness. How is it that we're going to keep our children in the fold in the face of the socioeconomic dominance of the Christian society and the apparent theological success of the Christian religion? This is a question that every parent, every teacher, every community member, every Jew needs to ask. How is it that I keep myself and those that I love dedicated to our purpose in the face of a historical reality which does not seem to support its reality, its truth, and in the face of counter-claiming theological or philosophical? I mean, this is a big challenge today. The answer is in the example of Aseret Nefesh. Right? That if we see the tremendous willingness of our spiritual leadership to give everything it has, then there is a path for my suffering to be ennobling and not crushing. Because I can take the power out of the hands of the oppressor by dedicating my suffering and even unto the death to God. Remember, that's what the rabbis do. When Caesar says to them, I'm going to punish you, they say, basically, no, you're not, but God is. And without struggling to change the situation, they completely transform it into an act of avoda, which, of course, is what it's doing in your machzor. It's not just that the death of the righteous atones as do the sacrifices. It's that if you look at the details of the suffering of the 10 martyrs, the skinning, the drawing of the blood, etc., you will start to see certain parallels to the sacrificial offering. And when you look into the piyutim that didn't make it into your machzor, you will see explicit seder avoda of self-sacrifice of human beings, including brachot on shechita and the spilling of the blood on the altar in the middle of the Beit Knesset. Because your children are in shul. That's where people get the news. You know? In a certain way, the whole order of tefillah is a story we tell ourselves 3 times a day. And what happens when you tell yourself the same story 3 times a day, over and over again? It becomes the reality within which you live. And when the crowning moment of that reality is the willingness to give everything you have to God in recognition that there is no other power, despite the fact that the hand that holds the sword might be a crusader or a Roman or, you fill in the blank, a Nazi. It doesn't matter. As long as you say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, when he does it, you attain the inner state of knowing that there is no other power in the world, despite what happens to your body. Now, do we want all our kids to go off and kill themselves in 13th century Europe? No, we don't, because then we won't have any continuity. So we're actually going to look, and this is where we can't go into it now, but the context of the Hasidei Ashkenaz is another piece of the context that I didn't bring in here, where what we're really going to look for is the Aseret Nefesh of living for what you believe in, as opposed to dying. And that, in the face of the socioeconomic and theological realities of medieval Europe, was probably, lahavdil, shalom nidamizet, was probably harder than that moment of martyrdom. Day in and day out. Right? And so I just want to leave you with this thought. We have internalized, whether you know it or not, an ideal of dying for the sake of God. And because it is so distant from our actual daily lives, thank God, thank God, thank God, it is hard, I believe, for many of us to receive the inspiration from Ela Ezkara, which we were actually meant to receive, which is not to die for God, but to live for God. And so, one, I would like to offer you this, that your reflections as you reach this point, we should all be zocheh to reach this point together, whether we're there physically or just spiritually. We should reach this point together on Yom Kippur, when you reach this moment of the Aseret Harugei Malchut, that you should really prepare yourself to give everything you have to God, and open yourself to that imagery. But you should do it knowing that there's 2 sides to the sacrifice of Isaac, which of course is the source of all this. There's Yitzchak on his way up to the altar, which is the Mesirat Nefesh of the Aseret Harugei Malchut. And then there's Yitzhak, when he gets down from the altar, which is the Mesirat Nefesh of every simple Jew who was able to take these messages and get up every morning and do what they believed was right in the face of a world that didn't always seem to agree. So we should be zoche for slicha umechila, the kapara, and all our zdonot should become zchuyot b'meher b'yameinu.